In today's video, I talked to Dr. Jeremy Tudway, who is a clinical director at Dimensions UK. I talked to him about autism and his career previously as a psychologist. We speak about the many issues around autism and understanding, what it was like for Jeremy growing up, and what gaps and cracks there are in the system for autistic people. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of MaxiAspie and the special series, The Autism Connections, and today I'm joined by Dimensions' own Jeremy Tudway. Jeremy, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for inviting me, I'm really excited.
So my first question to everyone I have on the show is, what is your connection to autism?
I'm the clinical director for Dimensions. We're a large organisation that supports people with autism and learning disabilities, or just with autism, to live independently in the community and to support them really to live the best life that they can. And by my professional background, I'm a clinical psychologist and have worked with supporting people for 30 odd years, he said. Oh, wow. Too old.
30 years. That is, not to make you feel older, but 26. So you've been studying this when I weren't even alive.
Well, there you go. But I think every day is a learning day, and actually, I think probably what I've learned more in recent years is that working with people who are experts by experience, working with people who have autism as a condition, and we've had this conversation before, viewing autism as a condition and not as a disorder or as a disability actually has expanded my understanding massively, and I think it's probably more useful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I always sort of get caught up in that question of how do you define a disorder versus a condition versus a disability. You know, I always sort of go, because I don't know what classifies one to be. All I know is I've never viewed my autism as something wrong with me, you know, something that's not right. And it's still very stigmatised, you know, you still see a lot of people sort of have that reaction.
Well, yes, and I think something that I find fascinating about the way that public awareness shifts or not is that in the 80s it was very much Rain Man, where we have a physically able, non-learning disabled, non-autistic actor pretending to be someone, and similarly the film What's Eating Gilbert Grape, where Leonardo DiCaprio plays an autistic youngster as well with a more significant learning disability. There is more awareness of it. However, I think that there is still quite a lot of stuckness about the idea that it's a disability, it's a disorder, it's somehow broken, as opposed to acknowledging that this is part of the continuum of being human. And that's not to downplay the fact that it's important to be aware of those things and to make the reasonable adjustments that we need to make. It's about understanding that. And I guess something I've often in my professional life worked against is something we call pathologizing, which is the idea of making a label into something that is the whole person, as opposed to describing a loose collection of things that might impact their life. So as a psychologist, I've always tended to try and understand the person around those things, as opposed to finding a convenient label, because at the end of the day, labels belong on jars and not on people.
It's really fascinating. Do you feel like a diagnosis and a label can also help people, you know, find out who they are, and, you know, because there's so many people now getting late diagnoses, and it's just like, as soon as they get it, it's like, oh, okay, that explains a lot.
Absolutely, and I think that I guess the importance of that is what extra does it offer to the person in terms of explaining and understanding my experiences, explaining why I found that such a confusing thing, or I found that such an unpleasant experience. That I've certainly experienced that with people that I speak to as colleagues who have autism or who are autistic. And I think that, again, it's about how we make a more of a shift as a society. A number of mental health conditions, for lack of a better term, are still have a huge stigma associated with them. And people talk about someone as crazy or as mad or as mental or schizo, which is one of my pet hates.
Yeah.
If a person has a psychiatric disorder like schizophrenia, they're a person with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
They're not a schizophrenic with a bit of a person tacked onto the end of it.
Yeah.
And I guess it's interesting from the autistic community, what I've learned is that actually condition first is a really, and boy, is that a liberating thing.
Yeah.
And that has definitely changed my language and changed my approach with colleagues to challenge them about that and say, no, for example, Max is an autistic person who works in this way.
Yeah.
But I certainly think it can be liberating. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, resources get tied up and you have to have the badge in order to get the resources. And in that sense, it can be very liberating. But as we all know, for young people and students, actually receiving a timely assessment and a timely diagnosis is quite often too little too late. And that, I think, is a deeply depressing thing. I don't think that's the fault of the diagnosis, it's the fault of the fact that the system isn't working.
This is, I think you're absolutely spot on to one of the points I interviewed Newbury's MP last year.
Right, yeah.
And one of the really good ideas that she had, and I normally, don't try and listen to every politician.
No, that's what I'm quite excited.
But one of her ideas really caught my attention, which was schools should have the ability within their special educational needs sector to be able to diagnose.
I think that will be a massively liberating thing. I think the whole issue of how governments have dealt with special educational needs is quite a tricky area, but absolutely being able to have that resource available at school where you could make a massive positive impact into the life of a young person and a student, and then reasonably adjust around what is the best for that person in situ. Yeah. I think that's a really important thing. So yes, let's hope that your MP is successful in sharing that idea with some of their colleagues.
I think it would be an absolute game changer. I mean, you're looking at 4-year waiting list now just to get a diagnosis, to the point where people are needing to go private, and obviously we now live in a cost of living crisis, so there's going to be a lot of people that can't even afford that.
Absolutely.
And it's just a forever ending sort of game of catch up, and I've always said if we can't get it right from the ground level, it then affects things like employment, it then affects social and living care, how you sort of even go out into the world. I remember being just about leaving school, and I remember Cam's just sort of going, yeah, you're finished with us now, and it's like, here's the world, bye. And it's scary. Do you find that with a lot of the people that dimensions in your self-support? It's
yes.
That sort of lack of help,
it's a lack of coordination and a lack of planning, particularly if we think about autistic people. Transitions are actually quite a key challenge a lot of the time, and if we know that about being autistic, why are we then not very carefully planning for the transition? It would seem to me to be fairly obvious. We do encounter that a lot, where, for example, the transition has not necessarily been planned when actually we've known for, in some cases, 10 years plus that is going to happen. We have a new initiative in Sheffield where we are working with the local authority and the NHS to create a a particular package of support for people as they're transitioning out of residential colleges or placements where they've been a long way from home, coming back with the specific idea that we will help those young people to develop additional skills that they might need for independent living, look and then design what we think should be the most effective way for them to live their best life prior to them moving on into a forever home, which might have support from care workers and support workers going on, might have very minimal support and even no support at all, but those key transitional skills that they haven't been able to develop, and that hasn't necessarily been where they come from, where their roots are. And that's something I find deeply upsetting, that the lived experience for lots of autistic people is they get shunted away to a school or somewhere miles away from where the family are, miles away from where they live. So when they're coming back at 18, 19, 20, they have no roots there, and there's been no opportunity to develop local roots and local networks. If you want to make the world a scarier place, take away people's social networks.
It's true, it's so true, because I think the people that have the toughest time is when they've got no supportive network. And when they've been in an environment where, for instance, that's been in place, so the experience I've got was, it took me 5 years to make friends at primary school. Finally did. Year 6 was time to leave, and then I had to go to a school all the way from my friends who went up the road. I had to go to a school which had a special education needs unit in it.
Right.
It was complete different sort of, from the village, from the sticks, the language that you sort of say, and then go into a school and it's like, it's just different language, different ways people interact, and you're suddenly having to try and mask and make friends again. And,
masking, yeah.
And it's so tricky.
Well, yes, and I guess that for a lot of autistic people, the pressure to conform to whatever, and I often amuse myself about this when people talk about, well, it's normal, isn't it? Well, what does normal actually mean?
It's true.
There's a wonderful old saying that, and this is a good bit of psychology for you, psychology gobbledygook. All people are like all other people in the same way as all people are like some other people, in the same way as all people are like no other people. In other words, it depends how you cut your cake about things. The key thing is the person at the heart of things. And I think historically there was a lot of effort put into encouraging autistic people to mask things. There were some very unfortunate uses and abuses of behavioural approaches to stop people from engaging in stimming behaviour, when actually now our approach these days has very radically changed. What is wrong with stimming?
Yeah.
It's part of your sensory experience and apparatus.
Absolutely, and that's what always I could not believe when they done the Sia film, where it was like if someone's having a meltdown or they're stimming, their advice was just to go in and restrain, and that would make them feel comfortable, lay on top of them to make them feel comfortable, and it was like, what? Like, and I've heard some real bad stuff. So I came from a school which could physically or positively handle restrained students, and I think even looking back, I would look at that and sort of go, there was probably a few occasions where it could have been avoided.
I would absolutely say almost all occasions it could have been avoided. I think there's been a lot of heat in some of the social debates. Behavioural approaches are simply an approach that's informed by a theoretical framework. The theoretical framework isn't wrong in itself. There can be daft applications of that. I mean, rather in the same way that if we sort of throw knives at each other, we're going to cut each other and harm each other. That doesn't mean to say you ban knives from surgery, because in the right situation they're useful. In the kitchen when we're cooking, they're useful. I think that the approach was very much don't stand out, don't make yourself look unusual, and that will certainly therefore help you with how you cope with things. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what stimming is about.
Yeah.
My understanding is that stimming is about how I cope with things.
That's it, how you cope with a situation. What, you know, and I know of a story where a pupil got kicked out of school because they would tap their finger on the desk. Now, they would simply get kicked out of school because it was too disruptive, but when they went to a special educational needs school, they actually showed the student, okay, instead of doing you know, that, why don't you just do that with your foot?
Absolutely.
And it was that sort of just sit down, have a conversation about it. And I always remember, because it was a headmaster that told the story, and he spoke to this autistic person on the day, and he said, but you're not tapping now. And she just said, look behind my chair. And she was tapping her foot.
Yeah.
And she openly said, it was only till I came here that actually someone addressed the problem, or what was deemed a problem, and said, well, why don't you try doing this instead? So if anything, they embraced the stimming and just went, well, why don't we try and stim in a different way? So it's not disruptive. Yeah, because I can imagine some teachers getting like, you know, annoying tap every. But at the end of the day, what I would say to that as well is, so what if it's a bit annoying? If it's helping that person learn and progress, and just say, for instance, the foot situation wasn't going to work, is it the end of the world if someone is tapping but they're engaged and they're learning and they're focused? Yeah, why is that a problem?
Absolutely. And I think you sum it up there. For a lot of autistic people that I work with, a lot of people with learning disabilities as well, that stimming is about coping with a situation or maintaining focused attention. I think other people's reaction to that is the problem, and hence the reason that Dimensions, one of the things that we've shifted is away from the notion of challenging behaviours or behaviours that challenge to behaviours of distress, because that's about, ultimately, distress is where communication doesn't work.
Yeah.
And where communication doesn't work is not because you're not communicating with me, it's because I've not made any adjustment to my understanding of what you're communicating. And I think historically, where things have been seen in a pathologising way, you're broken or you're not complete. It was almost like, well, you had to adapt to what the world wants you to do.
Yeah.
And that's where we get into these silly debates about what is normal and what is not normal. It's a bit ridiculous. And also, when we view either stimming or any behaviours of distress in that context, what we need to do is to think about, what do we do differently to stop that happening?
Yeah.
In the great majority of situations, actually, if I approach you, Max, in a different way, that is one that is valuing, but it's also a curious approach, I want to learn from you, that's seen as less threatening. If you're clearly communicating something to me that says, leave me alone, then it's down to me to understand, right, Max is saying, leave me alone, and I go away, and perhaps come back and say, should we have a drink, or should we go out for a walk or whatever, not saying, Max, I've told you to look at me and listen to me, and then start this business, the finger pointing, which is, I've always seen that as a wonderful way of almost extending your own power. But I just think it's not a helpful way to see things by seeing those as emphasising difference. It's not a helpful solution to try to change how people cope with that. What we can do is we can understand it, like you say, and perhaps suggest another very similar behaviour that is not going to disrupt people around somebody, or finding a way that we can help that person communicate differently to people, to account, to take reasonable adjustments for people who don't have autism or people who don't have a learning disability, which I think ironically turns it on its head. But I think sometimes people who don't have those things need a bit of understanding.
No, I completely agree. I think, yeah, what's always sort of been a thing in my life is those sort of sayings, you know, where everyone's a bit autistic, or to me, I've always gone, well, that's like saying to a pregnant woman, well, everyone's a little bit pregnant. It's just like, no, it's rather you have or you haven't. And once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So don't come up to me with a maths equation and think that I'm going to be brilliant, because you're being caught very quickly because your taxes are wrong. I've got my own set of skills that I'm good at, and you'll meet another autistic person who's got their own skills and they're very good at that as well. And it's just understanding, as you say, the individual.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting what you said there about when you could come up to me and go, no, leave me alone. Because I remember if I was ever in a shop at home, I'd go up to my room and I'd say to my mum, leave me alone. But I always know that in about 10 minutes I'd be thinking, why isn't she coming up? Why isn't she checking if I'm okay? If she loved me, she'd be checking it. And without fail, it would be 10, 15 minutes, she'd poke her head in the door and sort of go, are you ready to chat now? And it'd be like, they know, that this is someone that clearly knows me and clearly understands that, when I first came in, I didn't want to talk, but in 15 minutes he will, and that's when I need to do it, instead of, as you go, no, you will talk to me now,
whose timetable are we working to?
Yeah.
And I think that you highlight another really very interesting point for me, is that professionals have a particular set of training and knowledge, but that isn't somehow a key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe. It's a key set of skills and it's a key bit of knowledge. Parents and families of autistic people understand ways of communicating with those autistic children of theirs far better than professionals will, a lot of the time, not necessarily all the time. And I think that professionals historically didn't take as much notice of parents of people, of autistic people, and that I think was a real failing.
I think at first a lot of what caused autism was down, the fault. It was bad parenting or bad mothers.
Yes, ridiculous idea. And if we take just 2 minutes to sit down and think about, that's a really helpful thing to say to a parent, isn't it? It's all your fault, and don't worry now, you can't do anything about it, but it's all your fault anyway. I think the problem is that when you simplify a very complex phenomena, you're only going to come up with simple answers, and a simple answer in most cases is a daft answer. And I absolutely get your point about the idea, when you've met an autistic person, you've met an autistic person. It doesn't mean to say that somehow you have some strange insight into everybody for whom autism is a condition.
Well, can you imagine if we all could just do that? I know when I met an accountant, I know what they're all like. It'd be amazing.
It would be amazing. Yeah, it'd be very, very boring, and I think that's a bit of a fantasy. I think that sometimes the professional world runs away with. I've got 25 years or 30 years of experience of working with autistic people, so I know all about it. Well, it may be that you've actually spent 25 or 30 years doing something that was completely misinformed.
Very true.
And that, I think, that's about ego. And I think at times we kind of forget that professionals have egos too, and sometimes the ego comes first as opposed to the curious question. I'm a big fan of the idea of a curious question. Max, can you tell me a little bit about how that seems to you? Because actually I want to know about that and I want to learn about that. And if there is something that you're coming to me to say, Jeremy, I have a problem with this, I worry about this, or this is something that is really getting me down, actually you're Max, an autistic person, coming to me to talk about an anxiety or to talk about depression or to talk about any of those other emotional problems. And I think sometimes the phenomenon of diagnostic overshadowing comes in, that, can you please talk to Max because he's autistic? Now, actually, I think Max is depressed,
Yeah.
and actually his autism is a part of who Max is, but the depression or the anxiety or the anger or whatever emotional issue it might be is that emotional issue.
Yeah.
I think the key thing is that you have to listen, you have to think, and you have to take time. Quite a simple mantra, I think.
That sort of leads me to my next question, which was, what sort of made you want to become a clinical psychologist, and what was the sort of, I suppose, stigma around conditions for you growing up as well?
Wow. When I was very young, both my parents worked with people with learning disabilities, and at the time, autism was very much seen as a very severe condition, of the sort of isolated dreamlike child. So very much the classic Hans Asperger, Laura and John Wing type definition. My mother was a teacher who then who trained in the 50s and has certificates in teaching the backward child.
Wow.
Yeah, because that's schools in those days were considered ESN schools. I don't know if you've heard this, educationally subnormal schools.
Wow.
Yeah, ESN-M, educationally subnormal moderate, or ESN S, educationally subnormal severe. So the language was terrible, and we moved down the country from the north to London in the 1960s, when my father took on a new role of opening at that time what was quite a liberating thing, which were adult training centres. And these, at the time, it was very much based around the idea that people should not be in hospital, they should be working in the community and having jobs. So they were centred very much on industrial estates, so that you would catch the bus, the same as everybody else, to go to work. The work was not very well paid, and that was a major problem with it. But at lunchtime, you could go to the chip van to get a chip butty like everybody else, and then come back and travel back home from work in the evening. In the very early 1970s, my parents, my brother and I, moved into a hostel for people who'd come out from a large London hospital. And I remember as a child just it being a great place to be, and people would have meltdowns, and they would have behaviours that would make them perhaps stand out to people, but actually these were just people who I knew as grown-ups, and I was a teeny weeny kid, and these were grown-ups who would do things that were slightly unusual, and then we carried on. My parents were very heavily involved with MenCap at the time, and as I say, at that stage, being autistic was seen very much as a learning disability, as a diagnostic thing. And I was really quite shocked about how people would react. No, we don't want them near us.
Wow.
So as I grew up around that, I became very aware of social inadequacy, and always hated it. And then I was initially at school, I was very keen to be a rock star, but that didn't work. And I was also I was very creative, so I used to draw and paint. So I initially went to art college, but then found that really wasn't for me. And after reconsidering where I wanted to go, I decided that no, psychology was what I wanted to do. I'd carried on doing voluntary work with people. I became a Samaritan as well whilst I was an undergraduate. And that, what I like about the Samaritan movement was this notion it's about befriending people. So you walk alongside somebody, you don't push them from behind.
Or judge them.
Exactly, it's non-judgmental, and you walk alongside people, you don't drag them along with you. And that just fueled more of my interest. I was initially, when I finished my first degree, going to be a researcher and an academic. Quite frankly, there was far too much ego associated with the academic world. That wasn't what I was really interested in. I was still very interested in working with people and working with people with learning disabilities and autism. So I decided to become an assistant psychologist in the late 80s. Carried on working in an area that wasn't seen as particularly sexy or valuable. And a lot of people who wanted to go into clinical psychology wanted to work in straightforward psychotherapy or with children and families. But I was always very much more interested in people with learning disabilities and autistic people. So I specialised in that. I went up to Birmingham because there was a very big clinical psychology department there, some very inspirational people who worked there, who I was really quite in awe of. Professor Peter Trow was there, Andrew Yehoda, some of these people that have gone on and been great luminaries. Dave Dagman is another one who worked there, and Visa Carusa. These were amazing colleagues who really pushed things forward. After my clinical training, I then worked in a variety of different services. They were NHS services, and also worked in hospitals, some of which were secure hospitals, with the primary objective of wanting to do therapeutic work to assist people to come out of hospital. Eventually, I found that wasn't particularly satisfying, because what would happen would be that people would come into very specialised hospitals because of a particular issue or risk. We would do lots and lots of work, and then trying to discharge people from hospital back to where they could live in the community was next to impossible. And it was from that basis that I wanted to go and work more in supported community living, and in fact developed a couple of early trial sites, I guess, for people, where we opened up a series of self-contained flats and transitioned people into the self-contained flats, but very much saying, this is your personal journey. This isn't about a mini hospital. The support staff would be available there to assist, but this is your flat, so your kitchen, your shopping, you go and do your shopping for yourself. We can help you if there are particular issues about shopping and cooking. And that was a really successful thing. And at the time, I'd always been quite interested in moving away from just a professional view of how therapy had been successful or how work had been successful, but really getting the person that we were doing the doing with to rate how successful that had been. Some of my research work has been around that as well, but particularly how we could make straightforward adaptations to things to be more therapeutic for people with learning disabilities, as opposed to just assuming you couldn't do psychological work with people. When I started, it was very much considered that actually therapy with people with learning disabilities or autism wasn't worth it because they couldn't cope with that. I think that's rubbish. I've always thought it's rubbish. My experience and the evidence suggests otherwise. So I eventually came to Dimensions, and the thing that really attracted me to my work with Dimensions was that this was all around supporting people. We didn't talk about clients, we talked about people we support. We very much wanted people to live the best life that they can. So all effort was targeted towards doing that. Everyone from the chief exec all the way down through the organisation got that. And that was completely different as an experience to me. Whereas in lots of other things, you'd find people who just didn't get it. Part of my role was to write and produce the autism strategy for Dimensions, so that we could integrate that and actually broaden our offer for autistic people, acknowledge neurodiversity within the organisation itself, because I think that we were talking earlier, off camera, that workplace environments quite often fail to acknowledge.
Absolutely.
They definitely failed to make reasonable adjustments.
Absolutely.
And certainly wasn't something I experienced in Dimensions, but I'd experienced it in other work environments and parts of other work that I'd done as a psychologist, where it was almost people were blamed for being autistic, as opposed to the work environment creating a situation where the person's skills were used to the maximum, and any particular challenges in the work environment were reduced. So it actually, let's focus on ability, let's see that ability and expand it. Yes, my role was to design the autism strategy, and I was allowed free rein to do that and actually go out and communicate with people who are autistic with the writing of that policy. As you know, organising the Autism Summit, which was a great thing.
Absolutely.
And having, yet again, people with lived experience coming in, hopefully in a role that was an expert role coming through. That has certainly influenced how we've gone about establishing support for people with complex needs. We have that new transitional service where we've looked at simple adaptations to the environment, where we get rid of things that are confusing in the environment. We get rid of obvious visual transitions informed by autistic people, that's something we just needed to listen to. I'm hoping that has been quite a positive experience for autistic people, and we are planning to have another Autism Summit to review where we've got to with our autism strategy, and then look to develop it further, because I think there's a campaigning arm to that. And as you will well know, and your viewers will well know, we've had the Autism Act for some years now.
2009.
Absolutely. Yet we still haven't had the implementation of some of those lofty ideals. They just haven't happened. And that's not just about people staying in hospital unnecessarily, or young autistic people going into hospital early, which is terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think another really important thing is how we can work towards campaigning with people who haven't necessarily had a voice, and join forces in encouraging politicians to actually listen and then do the doing, instead of getting wound up in arguments and spats with each other about who did what and when
this happened. Yeah.
Boring.
Yeah.
And it doesn't allow things to progress forward.
It's sort of become a political Jeremy Kyle sometimes in the House of Commons.
Yeah, it's like a car crash.
Yeah, and it's like if your time was spent more productively looking at some of the real issues that people are going through, then a lot would be done. You know, I look at the Autism Act and the Equality Act, and then I look at the statistics around autism. You know, 50% of autistic pupils are expelled every year from school.
I know.
Less than 30% of autistic people are in any form of work.
Yep.
The contained rate of autistic people having to be put into mental health facilities is shocking. And you look at all this stuff and then you sort of go, well, what is being done?
And I think it's interesting that if you look at there was a piece of research launched earlier this week, the Impact Centre in Birmingham, entitled "Why Are We Still in Hospital?" And it covers a whole range of people with learning disabilities and autistic people who are not best served by being in hospital. We know that. We've known that for 50 odd years. I think that part of that is actually looking at where are the cracks between services, and this comes back, I guess, to my point about not pathologising. Does it really matter whether someone achieves a lower score on an IQ test as to their experience of feeling sad or feeling frightened or feeling overly concerned about something? No, it doesn't. But unfortunately, with the way a lot of services are established, is that you have inclusion and exclusion criteria. And, oh Max, yes, you're autistic, we don't have a service for autistic people. And actually, if you extend that out logically, it's a bit like saying, well, what, should you have a different bank? Should you have a different bakery? Should you have a different supermarket? I understand how colleagues in health services, they have to draw boundaries around things. But unfortunately, the consequence of that is it creates gaps between services. People fall through those gaps and get stuck. And so often, I think myself and my colleagues in Dimensions, we hear dreadfully traumatising stories of people who have just got stuck in a system because the system is inflexible and doesn't allow for things. So some of the people that we'll now provide support for in their own homes have been in hospital for 20 plus years, and actually they're successful. They're not getting distressed about situations. Incidents associated with behaviours of distress have evaporated. Now, either it's a miracle cure that we've happened upon and we ought to really bottle it and sell it, or what was being done wrong before was what was causing the problem. Much though I'd like to...
No, I think what you say is amazing, because I think to myself, like, that thing that you just said around, you know, do we have an autism bank, do we have an autism bakery? And I think if you ask any autistic person, they're not asking for that. Just as much as someone in a wheelchair isn't going to ask for, oh, well, wheelchair bank only. Yeah. It's like, no, you put a reasonable adjustment so it accommodates everybody. Exactly. You know, so wheelchair ramp, sorted.
Yeah.
He can, or she can go up the wheelchair ramp and get into the bank, and so can everyone else who hasn't got that condition.
Exactly.
It's just changing the way that we think and we do things, and it isn't like, oh, okay, let's just open an autistic bank or an autistic bakery, or, you know, I mean, look at restaurants. Restaurants have adapted very quickly to dietary and vegan options. You know, they didn't have to just go and open vegan restaurant only, vegan people only. You know, we have proved without a doubt that we can accommodate things into all of our lives to make it better for other people that maybe have a condition or an allergy or a tolerance, but it's applying it, and I think we're still behind on some people just getting behind it and going, yeah, why not?
Yeah, in a nutshell, you absolutely get it in a nutshell. So many autistic people I speak to and autistic colleagues echo that, and I suppose if I think about my own personal journey, if I had a time machine to go back to, the younger me reading these great tomes on what autism was and what autism wasn't, actually I'd say go and talk to the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
Put that away, because actually a lot of the research in there was rubbish. There were lots of these assumptions about, well, autism is, I think, Hans Asperger's papers. They were very interesting, but for whatever reasons weren't adopted at the time, because Hans Asperger being German.
And now what we know now.
Absolutely. But I think the language that we used at the time was had massive consequences that couldn't necessarily have been anticipated. So the whole myth that autistic people are locked in their own world and have no empathy, that's kind of one of the daftest conclusions that has been very, very resistant to change.
I think we have a lot too much empathy, and I think it's because throughout my life, because that myth has existed, I've almost been trained to feel more empathy.
Yes.
You know, because it's like getting drilled into me, like, you've got to think, how would they feel? How would they feel? How would they feel? And now I'm at the point where I'm at, like, always thinking about how they feel, but not really thinking about how I feel.
Yeah. Well, and Damien Milton, who's a researcher at the University of Kent, talks very much about the double empathy problem, where actually professionals assuming that autistic people don't have empathy means that they absolutely get the wrong end of the stick, just at that conceptual level. And another thing that I found really exciting about coming into work where I work now in Dimensions was the autism friendly initiatives. So we have a really good network of cinemas for autism friendly screenings. And we work together with a popular high street store to look at having autism friendly shopping. Now, I can definitely appreciate how a lot of autistic people will say, well, this is about autism banks and so on. No, some of this was about, let's have a look at getting rid of some of that sensory clutter, getting rid of the artificial flickery lights, turning off all of the alarms and it's only when you go in with a slightly different approach, you hear how incredibly sensory cluttered these environments are. There's far too many people in. There are alarms pinging off right, left and centre. There's piped music, which is at just the right level to be irritating. And there is no space to go to where you can be. So actually that becomes a really unpleasant experience for an autistic person or someone who has particular sensory input differences to go into. Actually, going into that environment when those things are all turned off is far nicer as a shopping experience. And interestingly, non-autistic people and non-autistic staff in the shops were saying it's far nicer.
Yeah.
Get rid of all that other fluff.
Yeah.
So, and again, those are small steps, but it's about raising the fact that we can make some slight differences and actually might make the world a bit better for everybody.
I was just about to say, I don't think I've ever heard anyone go, oh, I go into that shop just to hear that buzz.
Yes, exactly.
You know? And it is just like, again, those adjustments.
Yeah.
Which is why I love things like the Autism Hour, because it was like an hour just for autistic people. All the stuff was really censored down, so it weren't going to affect you as much as it normally would.
Yeah.
And I thought it was just such a good initiative, and I think there needs to be more of it. But I suppose it does lead me to my last question, which would be, what's sort of been a bit of a multi-part question, so I do apologise.
That's fair enough.
What's sort of the biggest issues that you see currently that you would love to change if you just had a wand? And I know there's so many and it's probably hard to pick, but what's some like ones that you just like to wave and fix that and make people more like sort you out? And what would be the core message for you want people to take away from this video?
Well, let's deal with them separately. If I had my magic wand, I think the first thing I would do would be create an awareness and a need for the resources to be properly directed. I think we waste huge amounts of resources on systems that are inaccessible. And again, go back to Damien Milton's point about what we've ended up by doing is creating inflexible services and a defence often for people who aren't autistic is they say, yeah, but autistic people are so inflexible. Really?
They conform most of their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hold a mirror up to yourself, mate. Just get some downtime and reflect. So I guess for me, my number one magic wand thing will be making those resources available where they need. And a sort of sub-element to that is listen to people with lived experience. Stop assuming that you can find the answers. Actually get the answers from people who know. A message that anyone could take away from this video: be proud of your autism. Be aware of the fact that you have a fine tradition of activism, and actually be prepared to talk up and raise your voice to professionals. Don't be frightened of doing that, because I think that's about advocating for yourselves. And I think some of the cultural things that have happened just recently, and I would say that Chris Packham's series on the BBC, wow, why hasn't that been mainstream viewing? We need more of that. But actually, a real take-home message that I get from watching that is an incredibly uplifting human sense of the fact that actually, if people are given the opportunity to have a voice, whatever that may be, whether it's words, whether it's pictures, whatever it is, then they can achieve whatever they want to achieve. So my take-home message for your viewers would be proud and go out and make your voice heard, whatever your voice is.
That's a brilliant message. And I just wanted to say as well, thank you for allowing us to hear your voice and your message to be heard, and thank you ever so much for coming on.
Thank you ever so much. It's been a great privilege.